Well, Lou, welcome to the podcast. It's so good to have you.
Oh, thanks.
So you are the Histamine Queen, which is why I wanted to have you on the podcast to talk about that, because I really think that histamine is an issue for many people that is not really talked about. It's certainly not in the mainstream conversation, and I think it's a greater issue for people than they realise. So I'd love to just get a sense of your story and how you landed on histamine as being your passion.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me, Charis. It's really cool to be here. I have had a history of chronic illness. And I used to work as a project manager in IT, and I had a pretty busy job and a full life. And I started to get rashes around my eyes, and I was getting tireder and tireder and tireder. And I ended up waking up one day and I couldn't get out of bed. And being a bit of a pushy A-type kind, I couldn't give up work. And I kept trying to work from home, like 1 or 2 hours a day over the phone, all that sort of stuff. And eventually I had to, give up work. And so I was diagnosed at the time with heavy metal poisoning and chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME/CFS. And the rashes and all of that sort of stuff as well. I also had exposure to mold. So all of those things together were part of what was going on. But I'd also had a history of IBS. I'd had anxiety and panic attacks. I had eczema as a child, all of those things. So when you're looking at the whole health, it's like, oh yeah, there were lots of little things I could see with my health, even before that happened. And so what happened was I studied as a nutritionist while I was ill with chronic fatigue, because, as you do, because being me, I wasn't really very able to do nothing. So I'd kind of like sleep all week and then drag myself to student clinic. And I had trained as a health coach before I got unwell. So I was already in that space and eating healthy and doing all those things, and yet I still got sick. Why? So as things progressed and I did my nutrition training and I started working with clients, I actually also was developing other issues. I had fibromyalgia. It had turned into chronic inflammatory response syndrome from the mold and the heavy metals. And then I had a drug reaction to the chelation medication I was using for heavy metals. And that point in time, I then found out when I ate a meal a couple of days later that I was reacting. And it was pho. It was the beautiful Vietnamese broth that I'd had from this place many, many times. And it sits there cooking all day. You can see it cooking away. And I had that, and I had some soft shell crab. And of course, huge reactions. I ended up with this swelling and red flush and closing throat and all of that sort of stuff. And I didn't know what was going on. And my doctor, they just sort of said, here's an EpiPen. So what do I do? Here's an EpiPen, off you go. Like, but what do I do? And so, of course, thankfully, because of my background and training, I did some research. And I had already in the past done a diet that removed glutamines and amines and salicylates called the Royal Prince Alfred diet, which is based around a hospital-based diet that is also sometimes called fail-safe. So I knew about that. And when I remembered, well, amines are histamines. Histamine is part of this family of amine. And I looked into it and I did a bit more research, and I put myself onto a lower histamine diet, and I realized that improved my symptoms. So from there, I did more research. I cooked. I created a little cookbook and started selling that. And I was working in that space. So yeah, I love cooking. So that's kind of how I coped, by creating food that I could eat.
That's awesome. Was there much around at the time? Like, did you sort of feel like you had to start from scratch? There's probably more now, but
there was very little information.
Yeah.
Back then, pretty much the only person was Yasmina. And Yasmina, unfortunately, she passed away from breast cancer at basically around about the same time that I was discovering that I needed to find out more about histamine intolerance. So I had already had some awareness of her in the past. And so I, bought her cookbooks. I read her stuff. I found that I was still intolerant to a lot of the things in her books. And a lot of people with histamine intolerance do find that doesn't matter whose information you've got, there's always something that you say, oh yeah, but I can't have that thing. How come this is considered to be low histamine by that person, but then this person says it's high histamine, and this person XYZ. So, I did find what I could, and I basically created. So I created my own list, I created my own recipes, I created everything based on my information that I already knew about amines. Yeah. Because a lot of lists just have histamine and they don't consider amine. And so I included the amine in my list, and I went from that basis as well. But also, the thing that people don't understand and don't take into account are mast cells. Mast cells line all of our orifices, like our lungs, our digestive system, and our mast cells are the things that store histamine, and they're the things that release it. And so what happens is, as well as eating foods that contain histamine, which are the things, okay, I've already got lots of histamine in my body, so I don't want to add more. We've got histamine liberators. And these are the things that liberate the mast cells to release histamine in our body. So, working through all the different information, some people consider things to be histamine containing or histamine liberators, and some don't, and there's a lot of conflict there. And the reason behind a lot of that is because everybody's different, everybody's mast cells respond differently. And so when we're trying to get research, even research of, looking at a larger population, we're getting really conflicted information. And then you look at something like, say, for example, a list that's also well known is the Swiss Interest Group list, SIGI. Now, that list is also based on population information. But the problem we have then with our population is these population of histamine intolerant people all have mast cells that will react differently. And then they also all have other underlying conditions. And so that's why we get a lot of confusion and a lot of conflict. One of my favorites that I look at is buckwheat. Now, buckwheat is listed as a histamine liberator, I think, on the SIGI list. And yet I have so many clients who tolerate buckwheat absolutely fine. And my expectation there is, well, the reason why they're not tolerating buckwheat could be mast cell, but it also could be a problem with grains and seeds and fiber. And it could be that there's something else underlying that issue to do with the bacterial balance or imbalance in their digestive system, like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or large intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So when we're looking at each person, everyone's so individual. And the lists and the recipes are wonderful guides. But it doesn't replace individual support at all, because everyone's so different.
So there's so much in that. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I kind of am a bit of a fire hose.
No, it's fine. I want to take a step back to the way I see it with histamine is there's kind of three key areas from a nutritional perspective. The one is the foods that contain histamine.
Yeah.
Then there's the foods that are sort of the enzyme blockers.
Oh, yeah.
And then there are the foods that are histamine that don't necessarily contain histamine, but they liberate histamine when you ingest them. Can you talk about those three differences?
Yeah, so the histamine intolerance isn't an intolerance to histamine. Histamine intolerance is an excess of histamine in the body. And it means our body is creating the histamine. So, histamine is stored in our mast cells, it's being released, it's not being broken down properly. Histamine is being broken down slowly or degraded slowly. And histamine normally takes about 3 days, roughly, to break down in the body, through the liver, through our metabolistic processes. But for some people, it takes longer because our detoxification and digestive systems aren't working well, so it recycles.
Okay, and maybe we should just pause to say histamine is absolutely essential, and we're not saying we don't want histamine or need histamine, but it's about much. Yeah,
and histamine's part of the sleep-wake cycle. It's a really important part of one of the things that helps us wake up, gives us motivation, drive. It's really important, but the problem is that we're not metabolizing histamine very well, and we're creating it within our body. It gets created in our brain, actually, and then it gets stored in our mast cells. So that's sort of the basics of, okay, we've got a lot of histamine in the body, and I call this the histamine bucket. If we consider that we're full up of histamine up to here, that's our bucket, or glass of water. That's full up. And then when we put the food in, we are filling in that bucket. So we've only got this much room for histamine foods. And there's histamine in lots of foods. It's a natural food chemical. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just there. It's present. But when we eat it, then the bucket gets full, it overflows, and we get symptoms. That's the basics of histamine.
And everyone would have a bucket that's filled differently.
Yeah. And there are lots of different things that fill the bucket, which we can talk about next after we talk about the liberators. So the liberators, I touched on that just before. Mm-hmm. So that is foods that trigger activation of the mast cells, and they release the histamine. So mast cells are like little pods that store granules. Like if you imagine those dandelion type flowers or whatever, they hold them and then they release them and all the little things come out. Well, that's like little granules of histamine come out. And that's part of our natural inflammatory immune response. Like that's normal, it's natural, it's great, but it's happening too much. And the mast cells get overreactive. They're like trigger happy little things, and they just sending out the histamine. And that happens with certain foods. And sometimes people blame the underlying chemical structure of the food. They say this food contains lectins, this food contains salicylates, it contains oxalates, whatever, because all foods have natural chemicals in them that make up the food. But in reality, it's generally just the protein of the food, and your immune system has created an association with that food, and it opens the mast cells. And that's why when we have a list of histamine liberators, not all people react to all of those histamine liberators. So some people's immune systems are more trigger happy than others. And some people find, I'm okay with a squeeze of lemon, whereas other people can't touch it, because that's a liberator. It doesn't contain histamine itself. It just gives those mast cells a bit of a tickle and they release.
Yeah.
And then the DAO blockers. So DAO is an enzyme in our digestive tract, and that is the first line of defense, as you would say, for our body to degrade histamine in food. and histamine created by our gut bacteria. And what happens with histamine intolerance? The majority of people have underlying digestive issues. Sometimes they don't have digestive symptoms, but there are issues there that involve the enzymes not creating either enough amount or at all. So, you know, we have what we call insufficiency of digestive enzymes. And often there are other digestive enzymes that there are not enough of as well to break down other foods, not enough stomach acid, lots of different digestive insufficiency there. So the DAO, we also have some DAO that's in our metabolistic system, so in the rest of our body, that is an enzyme that breaks it down as well, but the primary part is in our digestive tract. That's the main bit. And so the DAO blockers are basically foods, particularly like black tea, that basically are stopping your digestive tract producing more DAO. So, you know, if you're producing some, you'll produce even less. That's kind of how that works. And, you know, if you look at something like black tea, it is fermented and dried, so it usually contains some histamine. It's also often a histamine liberator, plus it contains caffeine, so it's actually not good for our nervous system, which is a big part of why we have digestive insufficiency, our nervous system. And then you've got the DAO blocking. So unfortunately, black tea is not
off the table. I'd be terrible.
off the table a little bit, which is a bit hard for people, but you can replace that often with Tulsi or Rude Boys or something like that.
I'm English, gosh.
I know, yeah. And I'm such a tea drinker. I used to go through pots of green tea, and now I'm pots of chamomile tea. So
yeah, it's just about retraining, isn't it? And I think sometimes when you want something badly enough and when you're so affected physically by something, that when you know there's something that's quite simple that you can do to help, and it might, and you know, for some people just cutting back on tea might make a massive difference for them, or coffee. Yeah, like if you're someone who's drinking, you know, 6-8 cups a day, for sure, like if you cut that back, you'll probably notice a difference. If you're someone drinking 1 cup a day, reducing the 1 cup might not make a difference. You might have to take other things out as well. But it can be hard, because a lot of times these are things we're used to eating a lot of, and particularly in our current culture, we're used to really intense flavors, because manufacturers pump more and more and more flavor into things. So what our great grandmother ate compared to what we eat now is so incredibly different. You know, we're not able to just eat some meat and some vegetables. We have to throw heaps of tomato sauce on it, and mustard and chicken salt and all these things with all these extra flavors, because our taste buds have gotten used to that. And that changes how our brain perceives food and flavor and taste. And that all can change over time as well. That's another whole interesting subject. So retraining.
Yeah, like retraining the taste buds. And it's kind of the same as when you have a toddler and you're training them to introduce new foods. It's our taste buds change over time. Yeah.
So earlier you described some pretty dramatic symptoms, I guess, from your own experience. I guess there's a spectrum of symptoms for histamine intolerance. And so I wonder if you can just touch on briefly where people might experience some of the symptoms on the spectrum.
Yeah, sure. So spectrum-wise, for histamine intolerance, that requires change to food, I suppose, would be what you'd be looking at. So we've got what we just call like histamine intolerance, pure histamine intolerance. And all that is a lack of DAO enzyme. There's not really too much else going on. The mast cells aren't really involved. And so that person, you know, doesn't need to remove as much. They just need to reduce their high histamine foods a bit. but that they're not necessarily needing to make a major restriction to their diet. Way down the other end, you have full-blown mast cell activation syndrome. And that's what I ended up having. And when you have mast cell activation syndrome, the symptoms are much more severe because the mast cells are creating a lot of histamine, and the amount of histamine being created by the mast cells on a 24-hour basis is more than the bucket. Yeah. So even when you've reduced all the foods, you're still right up here in 24/7 symptoms. And that's usually when I see, you know, more that it's like an anaphylaxis. I call it a slow burn anaphylaxis because it's always there. Mm. But if you go to the hospital, they're kind of like, they give you, you know, an adrenaline and it goes away, but then it comes straight back, and you can't just keep getting adrenaline all the time. So you're kind of stuck in this kind of situation, often taking lots of antihistamines and things like that, just to actually keep like at okay level. And that's the way at the other end. Most people are in the middle. Yeah. And they're kind of like, I have all these unexplainable symptoms. I've reduced the histamine in my diet, but I've still got symptoms. That's usually because of the mast cells, or because there's still things sneaking in the diet, or they're still eating gluten and dairy, and they're often one of the top allergens, as well as other top allergens like soy or eggs, or, you know, those kinds of things. Sometimes those need to be looked at as well. And, you know, the spectrum of symptoms can range from fatigue and headaches, rashes, itchy eyes, congestion, and often what seems like just an allergy, but it's all year round, or it's people have combined, they have things like dust mite allergies and pollen allergies and things. I often see that like together. Mm. And then, you know, you've got as you further progress, you've got hives, eczemas and other rashes as well that are present. And then, you know, the joint pain, the stiffness, things like the digestive symptoms, of course, reflux, heartburn, gastritis, diarrhea, and constipation, bloating, all of those things, because our mast cells line our digestive system. And it's actually been found in when they do screens of biopsy results that people with IBS have more mast cells than people without. They don't have enough to be considered diagnostic for something called mastocytosis, which is when you have a very high elevation of mast cells in the body, but they are still elevated. And it's been noted in research that it's common, it's interesting, but there's no real kind of, okay, yeah, like we can do anything about it or treat it or change it. It just seems to be something that happens. And I think that's, you know, a lot of times we get people with the constant diarrhea, you know, and that can be to do with things going on in the gut that are functional. So they don't show up in a colonoscopy, they don't show up in an endoscopy, but there are things going on, bacterial imbalance, overactive mast cells, all of that kind of stuff. So those are kind of the key symptoms that I kind of see. And as you can see, there's a huge range. Yeah. And there's a guy called Dr. Afrin in America who is a mast cell specialist, and he's a cardiologist. And he has an amazing book, which is a very big read, called Don't Ever Bet Against Occam. And it's about mast cell activation syndrome. And his belief is that mast cells are the underlying cause of the majority of illnesses. So he's found a big link between mast cells and cardiovascular illness, and, you know, thickening of arteries and things like that. So I think we're only just touching into really understanding mast cells. And mast cells have been linked to long COVID as well. And long COVID is MECFS when you look at the symptoms. like that, and fibromyalgia, because there's so much overlap. And the reason I feel behind all this overlap is that mast cells have a big part of this overlap we see between all the different syndromes and diseases and things that are going on.
And you can really see why people must bang their head against a wall when they go to the doctor with these recurrent symptoms that would be considered vague and non-specific and difficult to really pinpoint, you know, as any causative and underlying reason for it. And yeah, you can just see why people would absolutely feel like they're going mad who are dealing with histamine intolerance and just going around in circles. Yeah,
absolutely. And there's no recognized diagnostic test for histamine intolerance, and there is no recognized diagnosis by the medical profession. So the CDC don't recognize it. In Australia, it's not recognized by the GPs associations. It's not a thing. The only thing that is a thing that is recognized is mast cell activation syndrome when diagnosed, usually by an immunologist or an allergist.
Right.
And the tests that they use are false positive or false negative half the time. So there are a few tests they can look for. You know, they can test for something called tryptase. And tryptase is only one of the multiple chemical mediators released from a mast cell, right? It releases histamine and a whole pile of other stuff and the tryptase. But to try and capture that and to try and find, you've got to be tested during a flare, and your mast cells have to be releasing tryptase. And some people's mast cells don't release the tryptase. They're releasing other things, but they're not releasing the tryptase.
Right.
So as far as testing goes, there's a lot of work required to actually give people tests. Like you can test for blood levels of DAO and histamine, but that doesn't tell you much more than, there's a lot of histamine in there. So there's not really great diagnostic stuff available for the medical professionals. So doctors will look at you like you have two heads if you mention anything. And also most doctors don't believe that you can use diet to improve health. So unfortunately, I do find, you know, most of my clients do come to me and they've seen multiple doctors. They may have even seen multiple natural practitioners as well. And most people don't understand histamine intolerance. And it's complicated. So, you know, it's just one of those things that, to really understand it, you kind of have to, understand that everybody's so different even when they have it.
Yeah. So what do you consider are some of the really key drivers behind histamine intolerance and sensitivity?
So for me, I've got, I suppose, 3 or 4 main pillars that I look at when I work with people. And one is, you know, first we look at diet, right?
Yeah.
Improving the diet. So a lot of times we've got processed foods, things like that people are relying on, and switching that, improving our diet, and also reducing the histamine in our diet and things like that. I also have clients who come to me who have cut back their diet so much from all the conflicting information. So like improving the diet is a big part of, you know, we need all the different colors, we need all the different vegetables to heal. So diet is a big part. Then the other part is gut. The majority of us have a history, and now it's a generational history, of antibiotic use and use of Panadol, Nurofen, other painkillers. And they've all been found, of course, the antibiotics reduce beneficial bacteria in our gut, and then the Nurofen, the Panadol, all of those kind of painkillers also affect our gut lining. And then things like, as I said with the diet, things like emulsifiers, which have actually been found to be negatively impacting good bacteria, beneficial bacteria in our gut. So whenever we eat processed foods, if there are emulsifiers on there, I'm usually like, no, we don't want those. You know, sugar alcohols, xylitol. You eat a lot of xylitol, that breaks down the barriers of the cells, of the outsides of the cells of the bacteria. So the gut is another big one. And I find that people usually have something going on in their digestive tract to do with that bacterial imbalance. Either there's yeast, and that's usually present because there's enough room for it to grow, because there's not enough beneficial bacteria. There's Sibo, and we know there are 3 different types of Sibo as well that can all be present. Then we've got lower intestinal, LIBO, otherwise known as gut dysbiosis, which means, you know, an imbalance in the colon. And then, you know, sometimes there are parasites and things like that, but really I think most people are chasing their tail trying to kill parasites when we need to focus on that balance of the good bacteria. So microbiome restoration, or getting back good bacteria, is like a big part of this.
And are there, sorry, Lou, are there key probiotics that are your go-tos?
I use practitioner-only products. So
I'm wondering with strains whether there's some.
There's a couple of good ones, like L. plantarum 299B has really good immune stuff. Bifido, there's one, the Bifido Brev, which I think is the B10 strain, off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember. And then Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG.
Yeah,
those are like really core good ones. And then when I'm working with people, it depends on what's going on. So once you find out what's going on, like there are 3 different types of Sibo, you know, what's going on. Okay, well, we want to actually use this particular probiotic because it helps with pushing down these ones and bringing up these ones. And then we want to use these particular foods and manipulating in the best way we can what's going on by feeding the right ones and starving the wrong ones. Yeah. So probiotics, I think, definitely are something that, you know, there's so many things available over the counter. Most of them are not what they say on the tin. They might say they have 10 billion in there, and then they do the test and there's like one little guy floating around. So, you know, good quality, and also the right probiotic strain for the underlying condition. And there's a lot of talk about histamine containing or creating probiotics.
Yeah.
But the truth is, really, it's not so much about taking a probiotic that doesn't contain histamine creating strains. It's because you could take that, but you're still not getting the right probiotic for what's going on under the hood. And so for me, I focus on the right probiotic that changes the immune regulation, because 80% of our immune system is in our gut, right? That's where it is. And that communication through the epithelial layer, the gut lining, we've got that gut lining, we've got the bacteria, bad bacteria, food, etc., are connecting to receptors. That triggers an inflammatory cascade that triggers our immune system off. And then that's cyclic and comes back, and the mast cells kick off even more. And that is the bit that we're trying to target. So when we're looking for probiotics, we're looking for probiotics that help change and often connect to those receptors to change that inflammatory response. And so looking for specifically well-researched strains that work on that is what we want to be doing. Yeah. So, and then that brings me to the next pillar, which is the immune system. So we're wanting to work on our immune system, and some of that is temporary avoidance, and some of that is by changing that inflammation and that immune system triggering by the pre and probiotics, by the bacteria that are in the gut that are actually affecting this. Sometimes we're also looking at, okay, we're affected by mold, maybe we need to get that mold remediated, or we're affected by whatever. Maybe I see a lot of people who are like affected by chemicals at work. Maybe I need to change my work PPE. What can I do around, that sort of thing. So the immune and detoxification kind of pillar, supporting all of that and making that work better. And underlying all of those is the core pillar of the nervous system. And this is the key part that I feel is missing from our healthcare, the understanding that's starting to seep into the mainstream a little bit, but that real understanding of the connection between stress and our health. And when people think of stress and our health, they think of immediate stress. Like, I don't feel stressed, I'm okay. But it's not about that. It's about a lifetime's worth of stressful events that get stored in our nervous system and are often not released. And that storage, or that impact of events over our lifetime, physically changes our brain. So it's not a psychological kind of, you can think yourself out of this, like just buck up kind of a thing. It's your brain has changed. Your brain changes, and it can change because of the stress of chronic illness as well. So you can actually get chronic illness can actually pile on more stress, because then doctors don't believe you, and then you have to eat differently, and then your friends are not like being very friendly because you can't go out or you can't eat, or your partner doesn't understand, and now you can't work all the time because you're too tired. All of those things pile up as well. So you've got this combination of things. And I find a lot of the people I work with, I do a timeline. And when you do a timeline and you look at what's happened during their life, they've had, childhood experiences, which are called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, abuse, alcoholism, depression in the family, poverty, those kinds of things. But then you've also got the small t traumas. So you've got the big ones and the little ones, which are like car accidents, bullying at school, a bully boss, getting made redundant, going through divorce, losing all your money, having to sell your house, all of those kind of things that impact us over our life as well. And in our society these days, we're just kind of programmed to just brush things off and keep going. We don't really acknowledge a lot of the time enough, like the impact that can have on us. And we can end up, as I did at 41 years old, unable to get out of bed because there's a lifetime of stresses that have changed our physiology. And it's not just a psychological thing, it's physical. Our brain, our amygdala actually can sort of expand out and create more hypervigilance. We become more fearful. And I see a lot of this with people who the symptoms, they start as a niggle, but then they become this constant chronic thing. The pain, the other symptoms, the food, and then food fear develops, symptom fear, fear of medications, fear of supplements, and it kind of get worse. And they've shown with chronic pain that we only actually have signals from the brain and to and from the pain center for the first 3 months. And after that, those signals from the pain are not coming from where it was, like the leg. It's actually just being generated by the brain. The brain creates the pain, and the physical structure or whatever may be fully healed. And you get a lot of that, myself, I've had really bad neck injuries and pain and issues. You get that a lot with people who are training, lots of injuries, things like that, but the pain will still be there as chronic pain because it's been created by the brain. And that's all to do with our brain and our nervous system and the stress that's stuck in our sort of brain and our body. And then, of course, with a brain that's stuck on this high alert and hypervigilance, it's creating more cortisol. It's creating more adrenaline. It's doing that all the time. And so we're stuck in this fight flight. A lot of us have heard of fight flight freeze, which is a sympathetic nervous system. We're stuck in that. And when we're stuck in that, what happens? Well, our body thinks, I got to run from a tiger, I've got to fight a bear. And it turns off our digestive system. It turns off our detoxification systems, and it dials down or ramps up our immune system, because our immune system either goes sleepy and we get sick all the time, or it goes really active and we've got like autoimmune and we've got mast cell activation and all this kind of stuff, because our immune system's not balanced. And, the bacteria have free reign to do whatever they wish in the gut, because we're not getting blood and nutrients and all of that to our gut lining, and our gut lining starts to degrade, and the pH in our gut changes, and the bacteria have a party, and everything gets out of whack. And so really this nervous system piece is so core and so underrepresented, I think, and there is research, but research takes a long time to get into mainstream. And there are a few interesting books around The Body Keeps the Score, which is an interesting book about how the trauma gets stored in the body. There's one called Molecules of Emotion, which is about those chemicals, the biochemistry of that chronic stress. There are a few others as well. I'll try and remember them. I can't remember all the authors' names because I remember the book name and the author name, but I might not get them matched together properly. But Gabor Mate has written about trauma and the importance of trauma in healthcare. Bessel van der Kolk. There are so many interesting books out there and interesting research out there, and it's just now starting to get more known and more understood that this is an area that in our fast-paced world gets neglected, and we're all sort of operating in fight-flight mode 90% of the time because we're rushing from one thing to another, and we're not having time to have that relaxation and get into rest, digest, repair mode, which is our parasympathetic mode, which is when we heal. So that was a lot of info.
No, it's amazing. You touched on around training, and I think this is something that certainly that I see that people don't necessarily recognise in performance, etc., is that they're probably getting some sort of histamine response after training, during training, and it might be that they get a rash or an excessive amount of perspiration or redness, and don't necessarily attribute it to histamine, think it's just sort of a natural response to exercise. And how do you work with people where you see that? Do you get them to take a step back? Obviously the cortisol is driving that, as well as we don't really understand what the trigger is with exercise yet and how it precipitates a histamine release and response. But I just wonder how you work with people in that situation.
So my theory around it is because exercise is a stressor on the body, it works in a similar way to other stressors. So, we talked a bit about the histamine bucket, right? And if we've got a bucket that's this full, and then we're adding in stressors of food that might be histamine liberators, exercise, which actually, because it does produce the cortisol, we've got the adrenaline, we're moving into that sympathetic mode, because that sympathetic mode is required for us to mobilize, to move, to run. So that is a stressor. And then we've got life stressors, we've got work, we've got all the other things, right? And so when we're looking at our histamine bucket, it's like not just food, it's external triggers and it's internal triggers. So, you know, exercise is one of those internal/external trigger because you're doing it yourself, but then you've got all your external stressors and then other internal issues that might be going on in the body. So you've got a full bucket and you're going for a huge marathon run and you're full, and then you've got symptoms, and stress causes mast cells to release. So if you're at above capacity, my theory is that's what's happening. You're at capacity or over capacity, and your mast cells are starting to release histamine and other inflammatory cytokines due to that. So everyone has a certain nervous system capacity, a training zone of where they're at, both physically, mentally, emotionally, and, you know, dietary, all those things, right? And so if I have people who, you know, are working to walking down the road, right? Because they're fatigued. And so they do 10 minutes and then the next day they might do 11 minutes and then the next day 12 minutes. Because if they go from 11 minutes to 20 minutes, boom, they're out for a week or a month or whatever. And it's the same with the performance side. It's just at the other end.
Yeah.
It's just, you can do a lot more, but you've hit that capacity wherever your current capacity is and you've gone over. So it's really like you dial back until you know roughly where that capacity is. And then you work on the underlying issues, like the digestive system, the nervous system, the immune and the detoxification systems. And then you start slowly creeping it back up. But us human beings are most likely to go, I'm just going to I must be better. I'm just going to go and, you know, do this huge bike ride. And yet, you know, we've only been walking down the road and we suddenly go, we're going to go and run a marathon. And we love to jump into things big time. We don't like to take things slowly. And that's usually what trips us up. So yeah, dialing it back, finding where that capacity is, and then increasing it slowly is the way to do it, because that way you can slowly challenge yourself. You're challenging your capacity. You're also hopefully working on improving any other things that are causing issues. So as they dial down, you gain more capacity. And as we work on our nervous system, we get more capacity as well. So we get less irritable and we can manage work better and we can manage our human relationships and the difficult kids, and things don't stress us out. And that kind of part of it actually helps with training and running, and it helps with other things because our nervous system is so core to everything we do.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was reading an article this week, and they report that the athletes have a significantly higher intake of antihistamines than the general population. So it's obviously an issue out there that maybe athletes just aren't even aware of. And the other sort of, I guess, confounding factor is that with endurance exercise, you get sort of ischemic type effects in the gut as your blood is redirected to your muscles. And so we also don't know how that might impact enzymes and gut bacteria that then have a subsequent impact on histamine as well.
Yeah, and I saw some information once, but I don't have the specific reference about a higher incidence of Sibo in marathon runners and triathletes. And I would say that is due to, we're not getting the nutrition to the gut for a long period of time because we're doing extended duration activity. It's all focused on the muscle. And so a lot of runners are constipated. A lot of people who do, endurance sports have things like Sibo, and yeah, that shift of nutrients to the muscles where they're needed is probably part of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Well,
I'd love you to just give us an overview briefly of your program. Like, how can people work with you, Lou, and if they feel that they need to work on this in their lives?
Yeah, great. Well, I've got a couple of different options. So I have a free food list for people who are just starting out or wanting to find out a good way to do a low histamine diet. I have a 4-week meal plan that I've created for people to get in there and do a low histamine diet for 4 weeks. And it has loads of recipes and is really helpful for, when you're just stuck with what do I eat now. And there's a few other recipe books I've got as well. And then I've got a course, the Happy Without Histamine Kickstart course, which is a self-paced course that goes through how to eat, because we can change our food, but there are also things that we can do in the way that we eat and the way that we store our food and cook our food and shop, because histamines can increase in food after you've bought them if they're not handled well. And also how to eat for our gut, for gut health. So that's all in that short course. And then there's my program. So the program is the Happy Without Histamine method, and that's how I work with people one-on-one and also in a group setting. So that involves everything I've just talked about, plus work on things like supplementation, testing, health history reviews. We've also got, nervous system work. So there's I include a lot of lifestyle methods in there to help people change the physiology of their brain. And so that's called neuroplasticity. That's the basic name for what that is, that our brain is malleable, it's plastic, and we can make changes to it. And also involve other lifestyle stuff. I've got some great bonuses, a wonderful friend and colleague who's a Qigong teacher. I've got some of his videos in there. So there's a combination in that program of everything you need for all of those pillars that we've talked about to address more than just diet. And it's individualized, as well as having a group setting. So you've got that support of other people, because it can be really difficult when you've got such little understanding in the mainstream and little understanding by friends or family. And that support is really important. So combination of the support and then also the individualized one-on-one to help work on repairing and restoring our gut, rebalancing our immune system and balancing our nervous system and getting ourselves back to the state where our body's just humming away again. It's in homeostasis. It's this perfect balance of a body that knows how to deal with life's challenges and is a resilient body and brain and not likely to succumb to the next knock that comes along, so that we don't get flattened as easily by all the issues. And of course, the big aim of the whole program is to get back to full food freedom and eat anything and everything you want again, because that is what I love. And myself, I was restricted to a very small amount of foods at my worst. And I don't want to see people getting to that state. And I know a lot of people do, because of all that conflicting and confusing information out there. So for me, a big passion is getting people eating as much as they can, as often as they can, as soon as they can, and not being stuck in fear and horrible symptoms anymore.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love that expression about getting your body humming again. I think that's just a really lovely image
Yeah, just imagining all the little cells just happily creating ATP, lots of energy coming out, and they're just smiling.
So where can people find you?
Okay, so my website is happywithouthistamine.com. And that's my main website with all of my information. They can also find me at Olivo Health and Nutrition, which is the name of my nutrition practice. Yeah, Olivo. So it's the olive, but in Italian. And that's because I love olive oil, and it's just the best thing ever. And it's so beneficial for everyone. But yeah, the main thing is there. I've also got my Instagram and my Facebook. So they're both Happy Without Histamine. There's also a Facebook group that is a public group that's anyone can join as well. And there's, information in there. And I've got YouTube videos as well. So there's lots of different places people can find information and follow along.
That's awesome. Well, I'm just a wealth of information, so I'd encourage people to get in touch with you for sure, Lou. Thank you so much for today. I know that we barely scratched the surface, and there's just so much more that I'd love to cover with you another time. So I'm sure the conversation will be repeated in the future. But thank you so much.
Yeah, great. I'd love to.